I'm the landlord of an apartment complex here in Athens, and I know that composting is a good idea, but I just don't see how having a legal policy on it will work. I know that many organizations like the EPA have created many tips so people can find a feasible way to compost in an apartment, but no matter how many tips, tools, and materials the city provides to help jumpstart composting, people still won't do it. I know that the city said that if they caught anyone throwing out food waste and not composting them, then the residents of that location will be fined. But how can you figure out who to fine in an apartment building when multiple apartments are using one dumpster? I know I certainly do not want to pay the fine if one of my renters does not compost their food materials. I also don't have time nor the means to trace every piece of trash that my renters throw away to the apartment or the person that disposes of them. One of the clauses in my leases that I have my renters sign prior to moving into the building states that they cannot compost either inside or outside the building because it attracts unwanted pests and there simply is not any space in the apartments or outside for a decent sized compost pile. There are numerous sources that say that if your compost pile does not smell, then there is a small likelihood of getting unwanted animals or insects in your pile. But I really don't want to risk it. Who's to say that if my renters compost, they'll compost their materials properly, and there is a greater likelihood of their compost smelling and attracting pests, and these pests can get into the building and cause all kinds of problems that would require the services of an exterminator, who I would most likely have to pay to come get rid of the pests. Also, the apartments and the yards surrounding the building are a decent size, but they are no way big enough to comfortably have a compost pile that is large enough to contain either an apartment's or a building's amount of food scraps. If I allowed my renters to compost, the only containers that they could use would be too small to hold all of the materials that the city wants the town to compost anyway. I have noticed that cities like San Francisco have enacted mandatory composting policies where the city picks up everyone's food waste and handles it for them. I would be okay with this type of composting if it didn't mean that taxes would increase or residents would have to individually pay a service fee for it. I know that my renters don't want to pay any more money for utilities than they already do, and heck, I don't want to either. We already pay enough money into property taxes, trash pickup, and other services, and adding something else to that may not seem like a lot in the short-term aspect, but after a few years, we're talking about spending hundreds of dollars for the city to compost our materials for us. I personally don't think this initiative is worth it.
My major problem with having a legal policy that requires everyone to compost is the way that it will affect our neighborhood aesthetically. Depending on if they require us to compost at our homes or gather the compost to be sent to a facility will depend on how severe the effect will be. If they create a facility to hold all the compost, it will be an eyesore. Who wants a large facility in the middle of their neighborhood that will collect compost? Or, if we are required to compost at our homes, who wants to deal with rotting food while trying to entertain guests? Even if the bin is self-contained, for a family of 4, those bins are large and hard to hide. Then there is the smell. I read on ecocycle.org that composting isn't supposed to smell, but that's taking into account that the compost is properly taken care of, which includes digging into the compost and covering it back up again. If we compost at our homes, who is going to ensure that all of my neighbors are going to do it properly? Even with good instruction, something could go wrong, and one bad bin could smell up a whole neighborhood. And I really enjoy my outdoor space and use it for entertaining a lot. So I'm completely against this proposal.
How do I feel about a potential composting law? It would suck. That's how I feel about it. I'm a college student living in an apartment with 2 other people. Do you think that I have enough space to put a compost bin? We don't even have enough room as it is with all of our stuff, with 3 people sharing a tiny kitchen. I've been doing some research on composting, and they recommend that you have a ratio of 8-to-1 brown versus green material. Most of the food waste that we will be putting in our compost bin will be green material. This means that for every food item we put in our bin, we need to put in 8 times as much brown material. That's a bin big enough to hold 9 times the amount of food waste produced by 3 people, plus any extra soil that we add. That's a pretty big bin, and like I said, we have nowhere to put it. Most people even recommend that you have 2 compost bins if you're living in an apartment. That takes up even more space. Another horrible thing about composting is the time it takes. If you don't want it to reek or attract fruit flies, you need to drain it often. It's also recommended that you add a scoop of fresh soil to it every day. These might seem like small tasks that don't take up a lot of time, but when you're busy, it's very hard to remember and just a nuisance when you do remember. Basically, it's just one more thing to worry about in an already stressful life. Even if they do make a composting facility, and the law is only that you have to separate your food waste from the rest of your trash, this is still stressful. Sorting out your trash and researching what can be thrown away and what has to be composted takes time. The last thing that I want to do after a long day at school is worry about getting fined because my roommate accidentally threw a banana peel in the trash. So much easier to just throw food away or flush it down the garbage disposal. The worst part about composting, though, is that once the composting cycle is complete, I have nothing to do with the soil produced. People say, oh, put it in your garden. Do you think I have a garden? I don't even have a yard, and even if I did have a yard, I wouldn't have time to maintain a garden. So to sum it up, composting is a time-consuming, space-consuming waste of time where I end up with a bin full of dirt that I had no use for. And that's how I feel about it.
The complaint that I have with composting is the fact that the cost is just too high. As a mom, I have a strict budget, and composting is a commodity that I can't always afford. If the city were to mandate that citizens compost in their own homes, I would have to purchase a compost bin. According to the website for Lowe's home improvement stores, a good composting bin will cost at least $80. There is also the possibility of making your own compost bin, but you would have to purchase the material to construct the bin, like the wood and the bin itself. The biggest problem with making your own compost bin is that you have to have the tools that are necessary. Those power tools that will cost a lot of money, especially if you don't have them already. If the city decided to have a facility and mandate that you separate your trash, the facility still needs to be maintained financially. The money for this facility will come from taxes that I have to pay. The city also has to pay for employees to run the facility. If the city is going to require composting, then someone would have to enforce the rules and go around and check garbage cans, and this would cost more money to the city. If the rules aren't followed, then citizens could be fined as well, which is more of a cost to me, and I'm not willing to incur the costs of this just so I can compost.
Barry Goldwater once said, "You can't legislate morality. How can the government come to my house and tell me I have to compost? I do believe in the process and global warming and all that jazz, but make me compost today, and what will they make me do tomorrow? What's to stop them from telling me next when I have to go to bed, what job I have to do, what products I have to buy? This is a free country, and if I want to throw my food scraps away in my own home, I should have the right to do so." They said on the news that the mandatory composting law in San Francisco increased recycling from 400 tons to 500 tons. Well, I say 400 tons is enough rotting food. Yeah, a 25% increase is great, but if people are doing it of their own volition, why do I have to change my life to increase composting rates 25%? What difference will that make anyway? And why should I have to pay to change my life to increase something only 25%? I don't have the time or the money to do all that. Isn't 400 tons enough? And how will this law be enforced? Seems to me trash men are going to have to come around and check my trash to make sure all the items are being disposed in their proper ways. That's a waste of tax dollars, not to mention the extreme invasion of privacy. If the city wants to offer services to those residents who choose to compost, that's great. But don't come into my house and force me to put trash in my yard.